Now we're going to enter Flexbox and CSS Grid and look at what they do. But in doing so, first things we're going to encounter are their differences, and some of them are kind of major. But we got to think about them in a specific manner, just directly. Flexbox was the technique that took after something called the float technique. Float technique was more of a hack where you used something called float right, float left, and so on, and something called we used to call clear fix. We used all of those things for how do you say, to manage layouts. And the reason for that was there was actually no layout technique out there. Things were not in CSS weren't written for the kind of layouts that the modern web browser required. So we don't use that anymore. We use float, but not as a hack for its very purpose or the purpose it was built for from the beginning. We use that. But we when I see the first entrance of a new technique which is called Flexbox, and I believe it came around, I don't know, could have been 2011, 2009, something around there. And it was revolutionizing, of course. It was a game changer for all web designers because what it enabled me to do as a web designer is to sit and control all the children and only the direct children. Direct children is, just to be sure to make you understand here, is if I go into the Flexbox, for example, here and look at this, this is the parent. We could say this is the parent and these are the children. This is not a child of this parent. Could be called a grandchild, of course. But if we start with an up pattern, we would have grandchildren to look after. And it's not the purpose of how we talk about this. And we're usually using three things when we talk about HTML. We're talking about three relationships, so to speak. We have the parent, we have the child, and we have siblings. So these children, they are siblings. They are on the same level, next to one another. So I have siblings, children, and parents. So this is the parent level. Now when we go on, we'll talk a lot about parents and children and siblings, of course. So when I set on display flex on the parent that contained the class flexbox, what I do is this. And please look at this box over here to the right, and you'll see that when I save now, this happens. The display flex really changed the way its children stacked up. Before, they stacked up more like the CSS grid does down here, like from top to bottom, covering a whole row each. And now, instead of doing that, they are actually covering, it is sitting on one row here. And they will do that. They will actually follow this logic a long time for a long time. So I could even go ahead and I can write something really weird here. I'll do that. I'm sorry. I'll do this. Just set item. I'm doing nestled. I think this way better. So I go item. Go. I believe I put on the English keyboard. That's what's wrong. I'm gonna fix that. So I got item and I got display. Well, let's go ahead and we just write a width of 300 pixels. That's way too wide, but we'll do that. Okay, so it got 300 pixels, and I can just go in and check. Is this 300 pixels? Do you think so? I'm gonna hover this item, and I'm gonna look over here. It says it's 85 pixels. And if I want to look at there, it's actually, if you count the border, it's 87 pixels. So it's not 300. I just wanted to show you that. I know it might feel like confusing. Why did you show me that right now? But I'm sorry if that's confusing. But it's early on. I want to show you what Display Flex does. It actually controls your children. Even though the children says they're larger, they are with 300 pixels. A Flexbox has the ability to contain that and say, no, well, even though if you believe you are 300, you are not going to be 300 in my layout. Here's my rules, and you'll need to follow them. So the news here came into the industry was that I could, from a parent, control the layout or the positions of the children inside of that parent. This was kind of new and extremely revolutionizing in the way we think about design. Instead of having to write everything on every child, I could put a couple of rules on the parent, and a lot of things happen to every child. So it reduced the amount of code I needed to write tremendously, and also gave me new opportunities to do things I never could have before. So that's Display Flex for you. So it is a parent that controls the children inside. Now, thing is, it does so in a one dimension. It decides to do so in a row or in column. And we'll see what that is shortly, because there's a real difference in how CSS Grid talks about columns and rows. These are very different from one another. So Flexbox means one thing when they say row, and CSS Grid means another. So we can skip talk about it and just go over here and look at CSS Grid. And I uncomment this one as well. Save. And not much happens. I believe nothing happens really, because before we had this Flexbox that started to change, and it flexed up here and started to look at the content of it, and the size of the content inside is the size of the box. So you see the 12 is bigger and 1 is smaller. But CSS Grid did not. It basically did nothing, at least visually, but it definitely works. This is the way CSS Grid works, but it's a bit confusing. Right now it is. Later on, CSS Grid might be the tool you'll go to, because I think you'll love it. But it also could be kind of confusing at the very start. So let's look at this. Let's look at the code here. So is this the same thing going on here as with Flexbox? Is this a parent controlling thing? Yes, it is. Display Grid was introduced later on. I think it's 2015. And it's kind of became a standard of sorts very recently, though. So it takes time for things to take place and change web layout. This was definitely a game changer. It was not an unexpected one, because the success of Flexbox was tremendous. And then CSS Grid built on that and said, well, we don't have to think in one dimension. We can think in 2 dimensions. We have the X and we have the Y. And you don't have to choose. You can control it in both those directions at the same time. And that's the fundamental difference. CSS Grid want to do what Flexbox did, but it want to do it in 2 dimensions, not one. So why would we ever need to use Flexbox then? Well, there are moments, especially when you work with web designers out in the field, that they are more comfortable and their whole techniques are built on Flexbox. There are also moments when Flexbox is better. But it's not a rare occurrence. It's kind of common right now. But it's getting rarer. CSS Grid is definitely taking over. That's the trend. So let's get ahead and look at this. So you see we have one, we have commented on both. I'm going to do that again. So we get this function out of the way. I know I do this, but I think it's supposed to be like that. And then I go over here to this one. And I'll do this as well. Now you can see we got the next phase is the so-called 2 and 3. Take this one and I uncomment it and I save. Now I've actually made an addition to the flexbox here. You can see that I've written out an extra line. Before it said just display flex. Now it says display flex direction row. So the flex direction is a row. I could also change this, become column. Now it looks more like the one down there because it starts from the top and goes in one column down. Remember this word, in one column down. Good. And a row, it's in one row from left to right. Doesn't have to be that way. You can also go like this. You can say row reverse. Now it starts with a 1 over here to the right and builds from the right to the left. Likewise, you could also go with column reverse. It's not very often I see this, but of course you could start with both of those reverse methods. There are moments where it's useful, definitely. So it started with 12 and it goes down to 1. But going back, you'll see that we can go back to row. Now, grid has something very similar. This is talking about how things are going to flow. If it's going to flow from in a row or column and so on. Grid has something very similar. It's actually called grid autoflow. So we're going to look at that. Let's save. Nothing happens. You can see we display grid, a grid autoflow row. Nothing happens. This is actually because if you get grid autoflow row, that's the default. So if I write this, I still have this value because that's the default value. That's what it's going to be written. It's written here implicitly. Even if I didn't write it, it says it's on row. So, and this one, same thing, nothing happened. Could have done like this, same thing as this, because this is the default value. But now you get what I talked about earlier, the difference here about how you define a row and how you define column. You see, when Flexbus talk about a row, we're talking about something of a flow of row after row after row, because later on you'll see that Flexbus can actually go over and continue on to the next row and continue on to the next row and so on and so forth. It can definitely do that. It doesn't have to stay in a one-dimensional line. It is controlled by a one-dimensional feature. That is the difference. It's controlled by being this or that. It cannot be both. CSS Grid can be both. That is the difference. So I go here and I could stack and I could go to the next level and the next level and so on. Now, CSS Grid, it has the grid autoflow row. It also stacks in row. But it thinks it could be row and it can have a column structure as well. And now it says all the items could stack on an individual row. It's what it's saying. Just take it out. You take up one row. You take up one row. You take up one row. While this one says all your children, you take up one row. Not each of your children take up one row. So it's different how they regard. So like all of you, one row. And this one says, well, it's impossible for you to do so, or maybe, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It still says each individual item take up one row. So this is all each individual. So that's a difference in how they think about layout and or the parent think about their children, so to speak. If you were talking about these things as thinking parents, you could definitely say that. So I'm going to take this to the next step, because my next test is actually to see if it's possible for us. Maybe wait for a second. I want to actually look at this. If I make this a column, that's an experiment we should do. Oh, god damn it! You see, actually, it stacks up like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 12. Yeah, you can see it actually works like that, and I can see I did it already down here. So I've already actually thought of that before when I set up this code. So let's get ahead and step into that section. So now it says I should keep this one alive over 2 and 3. Okay, so I keep this one on still, and I go down here and open the 3 and 4. Okay, good. I'll do that. Oh yeah, that was exactly what I had earlier, because I actually flexed this one over to column. You remember? So now it says each item should take up an individual column. First it was individual row, now it's an individual column. So now we have made 12 columns because we had 12 items. This is very rudimentary right now, but it's extremely important at this point that you understand that column and row is not regarded as the same thing when you use Flexbox and CSS Grid. It's because of the fundamental difference in how they are thinking about their children. CSS Grid think about each individual item, and Flexbox think about the items together as a whole.